reason for thinking any significant harm will come of using the mixture. He's thus in a good position to know that adding the mixture is the right thing to do. But Sally also embraces ST1 through 4. Bergmann's description nicely brings out her enthusiasm. But perhaps, because of ST1 through ST4, she also thinks that she has no idea how likely it is that the consequences of the act would in the long run be for the best. For all she knows, it might be highly likely that the long run consequences of performing the act would be much better in the long run than the consequences of her refraining from it. This is an act she knows is morally wrong, mind you. Then again, for all she knows, this might be highly unlikely. She really has no idea what the possible connections would be. Bergmann now locates a possible tension worth discrediting. As a matter of common sense, Sally thinks she knows it's wrong to perform the act because of its harmful consequences, the immediate ones she can foresee. And yet, because she accepts ST1 through ST4, she also thinks she has no idea whether or not its ultimate consequences are likely to be for the best overall. Okay, that's a tension, but does it do the tension justice? Notice that Bergmann drops something out of sight. As he initially described her, Sally's knowing A's wrongness rested on two becauses. Because she saw A has a harmful immediate consequence, and because she had, quote, no reason for thinking any significant good would come from it. But in locating the possible tension, Bergmann brings out only the first because. But isn't the second because the real source of the tension? Sally knows that A is the wrong thing because, in part, she has no reason for thinking A will have any significant good consequence. Just as Alvin knows he should use the additive because he has no good reason for thinking this will do any great harm to the engine. But Sally also, because she embraces ST1 through 4, must go further. She has no idea at all whether or not A will have any outweighing good consequences. This puts things in a new light. It's as if Alvin, perhaps because he's getting the mixture from his 12-year-old grandson, boy chemist, has no idea at all whether or not using the mixture is likely to make the engine block overheat and warp. So he knows it'll burn the points off, but he has no idea whether it will do this. And that's what Sally really has to say, if she's really an enthusiast skeptic about likelihoods. Concreteness will help here. Consider hiker Sally, hiking the most remote part of the Appalachian Trail, where, to her horror, she finds a 4-year-old child on a railroad track. The child's foot is chained to one track, his hand to the other. Sally realizes she has two options: A, to free the child by amputating his hand and foot, or B, to begin a long run for help, the nearest help being a good 6-hour run away. Sally, let's add, is a great runner. She also is highly experienced in military field amputations, and she's backpacking all she needs for such surgery. Not far-fetched. I mean, remember that guy in Utah, who had to cut off his own foot a while back? I mean, I'm sure Al carries that stuff around with him. He's a cautious type of guy. Clearly, an amputation will bring some enormous harms to the child. But Sally must also agonize whether this action may bring an outweighing good, saving the child's life. Were she to hear a train blasting toward them, she'd rightly have the child, minus a hand and foot, off the track in 30 seconds. But Sally has no idea whether an imminent train is likely. She's a skeptic. She has no idea how often trains come by, whether 6 times a day, or 6 times a week, or 6 times a month, or 6 times a year. On Bergmann's account, Sally knows A is wrong because she has no reason for thinking any significant good will come from the action. We begin to see why this second because is relevant. We regularly take having no reason for thinking a good will come of it as presumptive evidence for thinking good won't come of it. Thus, normally, Al's having no reason for thinking the additive will harm his engine is presumptive reason that it won't cause long-term harm. If we break this presumption, we make the having no reason evidentially mute. This makes a big difference. The Hiker Sally scenario brings this out. Hiker Sally has no reason for thinking a train will likely blast by soon, but in her situation, this is evidentially mute. It affords no presumptive evidence that a train likely won't blast by soon. Sally still fulfills the two becauses, but the second because no longer carries normal presumptive force. She will thus feel driven to say, I have no idea here what the likely relevant consequences will be of my actions. I don't know which action I should do. I just have to choose. Likewise, Bergmann's Sally, by embracing ST1 through ST4, will morph her normal moral knowing into agonized existential choices. The more evidentially mute one makes the no reason for thinking clause, the more our ordinary moral reasoning grinds to a paralyzed halt. I propose this as the deeper source of the tension Michael locates. Does his defense, the M defense I'll call it, show it's not real? He sketches a view, M, that Sally can reasonably hold, and by which she can coherently combine her common sensism about moral knowledge and her endorsement of ST1 through 4. It's a typical Plantingian defense strategy, you notice. You learned this lesson as well. Paraphrased a bit, it goes like this. M, for any action A that is not intrinsically wrong, we morally ought to decide whether to do A by A, considering the consequences we can reasonably expect from performing A and its alternatives. We should refrain from A if the reasonably expected consequences of performing A seem significantly worse than those of any live alternative, and should perform A if the reasonably expected consequences of A seem significantly better than that of every live alternative. Does M show there's no real tension here? I submit it doesn't. M requires Sally to base common sense moral knowledge of what is right to do on evaluations of the consequences we can reasonably expect. But if Sally is really embracing ST1 through ST4, this embrace removes the framework of presumptions that common sense is here counting on. Hiker Sally cannot reasonably expect the train will come within 6 hours, leaving a mangled corpse on the track, but neither can she reasonably expect it won't come within 6 hours, leaving a healthy child to be freed 6 hours later by the chain cutters when they arrive. Her ignorance of the likelihoods of the intimate, momentous consequences of each act she considers leaves her not knowing what she should do. Instead of confident moral knowing, she faces nauseating existential choice. And if plain Sally in Bergmann's story embraces ST1 and through ST4, this will be her characteristic moral epistemic situation, because, the second because, having no reason to think there's an outweighing good, no longer has its normal presumptive force. The phrase consequences we can reasonably expect may seem to be sliding around here. A Bergmannian might charge, Artsky, you are perversely making the notion of evaluating the consequences we can reasonably expect slip around. You are turning it into an evaluation of what we can expect in the total consequences of the action. But this egregiously misreads the M view. M takes the total set to be unknown to us. What matters for finite moral knowers is the subset, those consequences about which we can form reasonable expectations. Your claim that is, if ST1 through 4 is true, we are always in a Hiker Sally situation simply ignores this distinction and ignores how M preserves the moral knowledge of skeptic Sally. The notion of consequences we can reasonably expect does slide around. But doesn't the Hiker Sally scenario show that it slides on its own accord? Hiker Sally knows that there are, or very likely may be, momentous consequences that are intimately attendant upon her actions. She also knows she has no epistemic